Zdravo svima, dobrodošli u specijalno izdanje Agelast podcasta u saradnji sa Sarajevo film festivalom. Ovoga puta na projektu imamo i sponzore, u pitanju je Mastercard, a Mastercard i Sarajevo film festival već nekoliko godina za redom imaju specijalnu nagradu za promovisanje rodne ravnopravnosti. A sada sledi razgovor sa našim gostom. U pitanju je Kaufman, oskarovac, čovjek koga znate po filmovima Being John Malkovich, Adaptation, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind i naravno neki od novih filmova poput posljednjeg filma I'm Thinking of Ending Things. Objavio je i novi roman, odnosno svoje prvo prozno delo koje nosi naziv Antkind. Imamo jako puno tema za razgovor, ali nažalost veoma ograničeno vreme do pola sata. Sledi razgovor sa Charliem Kaufmanom. Uživajte. We can start.
Okay.
Hello, Charlie.
Hello, Gald.
How are you?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
Yeah, fine. You just finished your masterclass.
I did.
How was it?
I don't know.
You never do.
No, I don't. I have no idea. I asked Bianca, and because she was up there with me, she also isn't quite. I mean, she said she thought it went well, but yeah. I think we were both, up there trying to sort of navigate. Yeah. That world.
So you basically rely on other people, what they think and what they say when it comes to stuff like that?
I think I rely on other people for everything. In a way that's unfortunate for myself. I'm trying to work through that. But yes, what is reflected back to me, or what I perceive is reflected back to me from other people, ends up being too important in my life.
Okay. Listen, long time fan here, but it's a completely different experience if someone takes your whole life work and jam it into a few days just to prepare for an interview, and then all of a sudden, even though you had certain ideas and perceptions of what your films are about or what your films are like, but once you watch them in a row, then certain different patterns come up to the surface. And when I was thinking about what we should talk about, all of a sudden I realized that I should put all my notes away and then just talk about these ideas and motives that are repeating within your work. And one thing that I have noticed is there's a certain obsession, I would say, in lack of better word, with death. In a way. So do you think about death often?
No, I never do.
But you write about it a lot.
No, I think about death all the time. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously we're all, getting closer to death. That by definition, we're all getting closer to death. But, as I get older and that much closer to, who knows when or how or why, I think about it a lot.
Yeah, so what does it actually represents to you, and what have you figured out about it?
Well, I haven't figured anything out about it. I mean, I don't know that anyone has. I mean, it's sort of, something we talked about in the masterclass is the sort of my living with anxiety about the future, and that just doesn't mean just about death. It means, in whatever eventuality. Yeah. But death is one of them, and the ultimate one. So I haven't figured anything out about it, but I don't have any epiphany to share with you. It's just something that is there and is mysterious and hard to sort of fathom what it means to not be in the world. And that I think about that, and then I think about how it'll occur, and I think about time and time management or bad time management, and I think about regret and and time spent. I mean, thinking about death also leads to thinking about one's past and what one has or has not done in one's life. And so, yeah, I guess that's it.
Well, yeah, those are the other two things that I wanted to talk about also, but we'll reach that point.
Okay.
But first of all, how do you cope with writing so much about death and certain scenarios revolving death? For example, if you take two of your films next to each other, Synecdoche, New York, and the latest one, I'm thinking about ending things. Both of those things revolve around death, but in a different manner, completely different manner. It seems to me. I know that you are not a big fan of analysis of your films or giving any explications whatsoever, because you want viewers to have their own personal experience.
Yes.
If you explain things, then nothing makes sense. But making the things in the first place, right? But it seems to me, watching your latest film, that once you meet Jack as a janitor, you realize, seems to me, that the whole movie that we have seen was actually, in the lack of a better word, flashback of his entire life in the moment before he dies. And in Synecdoche, you have the beginning and the end of everything begins with dying and ends with dying, and at the same time, without knowing when it's going to come, in which way, what's going to happen. You have two people, one obsessing about it and therefore not living life to its fullest, and the second one, his wife, not caring about it at all, which is the reason why she dies, but her shorter life is more fulfilled than his, and there's a question about it: which one is the worst? Which one is worse than the previous one? So there is all these different concepts of handling and thinking about dying, but there's also this inevitable impossibility of understanding death. So there's a clash in between those two. There's like a dichotomy of it. And how do you cope with that?
How do I cope with not understanding death?
Yeah. And writing so much about it, taking so much of your time, but not being able to do anything about it.
Well, I don't necessarily choose what I write about.
Okay.
What I write about is what I think about. And so if I'm thinking about something, it ends up being in the thing I'm working on. I don't start out generally knowing where something is going to go when I'm writing. So where it goes is where my mind has gone in the process of writing it. In the case of thinking of ending things, there was a book that it's based on, and so the basic story follows the trajectory of the book. But the specifics within that are stuff that I didn't know until I sat down to write it. So, I often have said that I like to think of my work as kind of a Rorschach test, and that goes back to what you said about me not wanting to explain things to people because I want them to have their experience. Like I put this out there, and then you interact with it based on your own life and your own thoughts, and which you have done, and with the things that you've seen of mine, and I think that I have done in the process of writing them. You know what I mean? Like this is the thing I'm going to write about, and then it turns out that this is what the specifics are, or that it's going to be about the character dying, or I remember once I started working on Synecdoche that I felt like that no story is over until the character that you're writing about has died, because that's the end of every story. It's not the end of every story that's written, in terms of fiction, but it's the end of everybody's story. One way or another, everybody ends up dying. So I decided to take that character and follow him through to see what would happen to him in the process of him living his life and then it ending. And so that was sort of the initial impetus, and then it became what it became.
Okay, yeah, but if you say it's a kind of a Rorschach test, the process of writing it, and while you're writing it, you have no idea where you're going to end up. So that means that you're basically somewhere same level as your characters. You're basically making a dialogue with them and finding out things as you go. But what is then the initial thing that takes you to writing?
takes me to writing in general or specific?
Yeah, there's specific things. Like, for example, for example, the latest movie that we've been talking about.
I don't know. I was saying in the master class that I was originally hired to write Synecdoche, New York, by Sony Pictures because they wanted Spike Jonze and I to do a horror movie. And I started to think about things that were interesting to me as a horror movie, things that were really scary, as opposed to, because I'm not interested in the other type of horror movie. So I think I was going to think about things that are scary, and all of those things that Caden goes through in that movie are things that I thought were scary. They're issues of loneliness and isolation and failure and artistic failure and illness and losing the relationship that one has with one's family and unrequited love and regret and death. And so those were the things that I was working with. And and when I took on I'm Thinking of Ending Things, it was, initially it was somewhat pragmatic. I was trying to get a movie made, and I thought that I could have a better chance of getting a movie made, because it's been very difficult for me to get stuff made, was if I wrote a thriller, and if it was a pre-existing thing, like a novel that the studio could look at and go, yeah, we want to make this thriller. And so it was very calculated on my part, and I picked something that was very small. It had 2 characters, and it took place mostly in a car. And that interested me because it seemed impossible to make that interesting. So I wanted to try to figure out how to do that. Once I got the job, I had to then do something that I felt was true with it. And I think it ended up not being a thriller, and certainly not in a conventional sense, because I wasn't interested in that aspect of it. And I wasn't going to put those elements into it just to satisfy some sort of genre need. So, then it was like, okay, now I've got this canvas and I have to figure out how to paint this story in a way that makes sense to me. And, some of the same issues come up. Obviously, there's within the story that the book is based on, there's a kind of an empty life and a failure and the character is trying to decide what to do about it towards the end of his life. And that opened up possibilities for me in terms of things that I'm interested in.
Of course. Well, interesting thing is that the original book, on the back cover, it says, by the end of this book, you're going to be horrified, but having no idea why. So it kind of fits the profile of something.
Yeah, but the book was very violent in certain ways, and that I didn't include. I didn't, the ending of that book is very gory, and I didn't want it. I didn't want to film that. I wasn't interested in it.
Yeah, you were interested in more existential type of things.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, because what we see with Jake as a character are those 2 things that you have repeatedly said during just now. It's regret and having a life in which he haven't had any courage to make anything about it. So he had, like, it seems to me, a lot of potential as a scientist, as for finding love in his life, or as we see at the end of the film, he's receiving Nobel Prize, right? Yeah, which is completely opposite of the life he actually lived.
Right.
So it's actually him dealing with regret and with not having courage to do anything about his wishes and desires in life.
And maybe interestingly, his fantasy, so all of his ideas about the world are based on books and movies and things like that he's read and consumed, and that Nobel Prize scene is a direct ripoff of the scene in A Beautiful Mind. Word for word, it is what Russell Crowe says, which is, by the way, bullshit. The guy who it's based on never said any of those things in his Nobel speech. So I wanted to kind of point to the emptiness even of that fantasy, his fantasy is based on a lie, and that which is not something you necessarily know when you watch the movie. But if you ever come across A Beautiful Mind, after you've seen this movie, you'll go, wait a minute, that sounds like something I've seen.
Well, yeah, and then having these parallel characters toward the end of the film when the musical starts, it seems like, you know, his fantasy going over the top, like complete opposite of his life, like not just living through his fantasies, but making them as a musical.
Yeah.
But you took that from Oklahoma, right?
That's correct, which is the play that the high school students are rehearsing earlier in the thing. And it's been suggested that this movie, they live in Oklahoma, and there's a musical called Oklahoma, obviously. And because they live there, the high school every few years does Oklahoma, you know, as one would imagine they would. So because he's been a janitor at the school for decades, he's seen many, many productions of it. So again, it's in his brain, and the character that he thinks of himself as is a sort of a much despised character in the musical, who wants to be the boyfriend of the main woman, but doesn't have a chance to be. So he sees himself as that character.
Second thing that I have noticed that also the motives that you have in your work is time, and the way you deconstruct time, and the way you make time, I don't know, in a way random. It doesn't matter. Sometimes it's really subtle, like small things that you don't really notice watching it for the first time. You have to pay attention to it the second or the third time you watch things. For example, of course, in Synecdoche, when you see the newspaper is one date, then on the radio is Halloween, and then and it all happens in a very short amount of time. But you also played with time much more obviously in the latest film, and time is something that you do make a thing out of it, but what's the idea behind it? I mean, what time represents to you?
Well, time represents one's life.
Yeah,
right. That's what.
But those jumps in between, making it chronologically, like.
Well, I mean, in Synecdoche, at the opening scene, which you're referring to, is I think I was trying to figure out a way to suggest the sort of like sameness of every morning. You know, every morning, this is his life. It's, you know, this conversation with his wife. It's this breakfast. It's this newspaper. The daughter's going to complain about breakfast, and they blur into one, which was my experience. So I was trying to convey that you know, if you were to ask me to single out one breakfast in a string of breakfasts, I wouldn't be able to. They're all the same, you know, and so to convey that, I would just have one breakfast, but that it would go through all of these days, and it seemed like a fun idea, and I think it foreshadows Caden's relationship to time throughout the movie, which is that it's sort of his enemy in a way. It's something that he can't pin down and he can't control, and he's sort of moving towards, you know, an end, but he can't be present in the moment of his life. And so that blur, you know what I mean? Like that blur of like 2 months being one breakfast is a way of not being present in your life. You're not seeing the differences. There are differences between every breakfast that you have, even if they're similar in their construction. But unless you're paying attention to your life, you're not going to see them, and you will remember them as a blur and that's a way to look back at one's life and remember the blur of it, as opposed to the experience of being there for everything, and which would make your life more full and would slow down the relentless, train of time that you feel like you're experiencing when you don't pay attention.
Yeah, but
so you wake up and it's 17 years later. Like in the play, it's like, we've been doing this for 17 years, Caden, and I don't think he knows that. And we as the audience don't know it either because of the way the movie is, set up from his point of view. So it's a sort of a startling thing.
Yeah, but I'm thinking of ending things. You see those huge time jumps. For example, in the house scene, the second part of the film, when they're visiting his parents, you see huge time shifts, which are obvious because they are much older and struggling with his mother struggling with Alzheimer. I think it's Alzheimer, right? And
his father is.
His father is. Yeah, father Alzheimer, but mother is.
We don't know.
We don't know.
She's unwell, but it's not specified.
It's not specified. Yeah. And thinking about what would be the reasons to do something like that. Well, reaching towards the end of the film, you somehow, that's my deconstruction of it at least, is that he had this imaginary perfect woman who turns out to be the figure of his imagination, and then imagining, for example, what it would be like to bring her home to meet the parents, but not really sure when he's going to do that. We switch time frames as we do, representing something which is really difficult to pinpoint in a way, and then seeing this time play is it's an interesting choice of things to do within this story.
Well, I think if you think about memory and combine that with fantasy, which is what it is, right? It's the memory of the various interactions that he's had with his parents in his life, and then fantasizing about it with this imaginary woman, then that it wouldn't be continuous.
Yeah.
If you're at a point in your life where you've seen your parents younger and you've seen your parents older and you've seen your parents dead, then you would jump around. You go, what would it be like if she were with my elderly parents? What would it be like if she was with my young parents? And there's no order to that because the order is gone. It's just stuff in your brain. Yeah. You can jump around, and you would jump around. If one thinks about one's past, one can remember when one is a child and one was at university, and you can do those within, with a flip of a switch. And you would, right?
Yeah.
Moving through it, you can't do it, but in memory, you can.
Yeah. The third thing that I've noticed, and you have also mentioned, that is regret. So then they're signaling me we don't have much time left.
Okay.
It's death, time, and regret. How does regret fit those previous two narratives?
Well, I think maybe it seems conspicuous to me that regret is a result of time and movement towards death, right? Because regret comes from having lived and making decisions that maybe are not good, and recognizing that the amount of time you have left is getting more and more limited, and you cannot correct. Well, you can't correct anything that happened in the past. It's set. It's over. One has to live with it, I guess, and but then you're also dealing with the fact that maybe you want to try to figure out how to change, and your time is getting more and more limited, as everyone's time does as they move in the trajectory that we all move, which is towards death. That's what I think.
Yeah, okay. I wanted to ask you a few more questions. I don't know how much time we have left, but first, okay, but when before you started directing, I'm interested in the reasons why have you started directing in the first place. But before that, you chose very interesting directors for your previous films. You mentioned Spike Jonze and, for example, Michel Gondry also, which I knew them primarily as music video directors. And the films they made for you, Internal Fashion, The Spotless Mind, and Adaptation, right? They were their jumping board. Those were the films that made them directors in the public eye, like film directors. And how did you choose them?
Well, I mean, yeah, the first thing I would say is that it was Being John Malkovich that Spike directed. That was the first thing that I think put him in that world. I mean, he was obviously, both Michel and Spike were very successful video directors and commercial directors. Before I knew them, Spike chose me. Yeah? I mean, well, I had written the script, Being John Malkovich, and was kicking around for a long time, and nobody wanted to make it. And Spike read it and wanted to make it. And I was happy that somebody wanted to make it. I didn't know who he was. I wasn't in that world of, MTV. I didn't know that stuff. So, but, it turned out to be a very sort of like fruitful relationship that we had, collaboration. And then I met Michel through Spike. Okay. They were friends, and Michel was very interested. He'd read Being John Malkovich. He wanted to make Being John Malkovich, but Spike had already gotten the rights to it. So then Michel and I started to work on Eternal Sunshine, and I needed to write it. And then while I was writing it, Michel was very anxious to direct something. I had another script called Human Nature, which was already written. So he directed that first, and that was our initial collaboration. Yeah, and that's how that happened. I didn't choose them.
Okay, and one last question.
Yeah.
Well, I got plenty of more, but unfortunately we don't have time.
Okay.
Anomalisa, the stop motion film, which is based on Frigoli Delusion, which is quite interesting choice to make a stop motion film about. But you collaborated with Dan Harmon on it. He created the stop motion, who we know by the show Rick and Morty, right? So how did that collaboration start?
Yeah, well, that collaboration started not with Dan. I didn't know Dan, but Dan's partner in that company, which is called Starburns, the animation company, is a guy named Dino Stamatopoulos. And he and I had worked together on a comedy show when we were younger, and he approached me to do it. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we don't have enough. We don't have time left. So thank you for this conversation.
Thank you very much.
I'm hoping you're having a great time here in Sarajevo.
I'm loving it. Yeah.
And see you around.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.